Allora, abbiamo qui con noi in studio Robin Morgan, statunitense, poeta, scrittrice, femminista, teorica, attivista. Tante figure insieme in una stessa persona. E l'intervista di oggi sarà esattamente su tutte queste sue sfaccettature, su queste sue caratteristiche così uniche, anche nel panorama nordamericano. Robin Morgan è in Italia in questo momento per una ragione particolare. È stato appena pubblicato dalla Baldini Edizioni di Milano un suo saggio importante, un saggio che si chiama Il demone amante, Sessualità del terrorismo. È un saggio che Robin ha scritto diciamo circa 9 anni fa, esce solo oggi in Italia per un ritardo delle case editrici italiane. Certamente questo libro continua a essere di assoluta attualità e ne parleremo nel corso dell'intervista. E nel corso dell'intervista chiederemo a Robin di raccontarci un pochino anche che cosa sta succedendo nei femminismi nordamericani e anche che cosa sta succedendo nei femminismi in giro per il mondo. Perché una delle caratteristiche del lavoro politico e femminista di Robin è di non pensare a se stessa come a nordamericana e basta. Si pensa cittadina del mondo, il che vuol dire che il suo impegno politico degli ultimi anni è stato essenzialmente in quello che Robin chiama il sud del mondo, il sud globale del mondo. Adesso passiamo la parola direttamente a Robin perché è inutile sprecare altro tempo. Robin, can we start with a short self-introduction? I was telling that you are many things. You are an activist, a feminist, a theorist, a poet, a writer.
Capisci?
Okay. So, since this is a very special brand of a person, could you tell us more about your personal history? Who brought you here to be such a complex figure?
I have no idea. It sort of does tire one out, though. Well, no, I always knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was about 4 years old, a scribbler. So the word and the magic of what communication could do always drew me. But in my teenage years, I became political in terms of the civil rights movement first in my country. Then in my 20s, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the so-called New Left, which I later came to call the Boys Movement, and the explosion of feminist consciousness, of women's rage and activism and vision thereafter. And then became a feminist activist and proudly one of the founders of this wave of the contemporary feminist movement in my country, and an activist in the global women's movement, which is my special passion. In terms of the way that it informed the writing and vice versa, it was an interesting process. I think I really do believe that a writer is very much a product of her or his time. Even the so-called immortals who are more than of their time. I always like to think of Dante, for example, in Florence, even though he had to get out of Florence in order to get his real work done. But of course, Dante, who now belongs to the entire world, thought of himself very much as a political being. So I think that a stand of apolitics for a writer is, in effect, in some ways, almost a reactionary stand. On the other hand, politics can be a jealous god, and I don't ever believe in art being in the service of politics. So what that means for me is, on the one hand, a real gratitude, an enormous gratitude to the contemporary global women's movement, because it has also helped free my voice in a way that, had I continued writing as I did as a very young writer, in a kind of imitative, boring, patriarchal mode, trying so hard to be one of the boys, the work would have suffered, and certainly I would have. So there was a way in which this explosion of energy and rage and vision and consciousness helped me as an artist replace myself in the world and see it through actually my own eyes, which happen to be of a female human being at a time on this planet when being female or male makes an enormous difference. And then I began to write out of that consciousness, not, I hope, jargonistic, rhetorical poems of sort of shake the tambourine to the revolution, but poems that used language in a way that hadn't been used before, brought nouns like diaper and dishcloth and menstrual fluid into poetry, when previously they had been verboten. You know? Men could write about their genitalia, women could not. But also the detritus of a woman's life, small things, attention to detail. And detail is always good in poetry and in good prose. So there was a strange symbiosis, because those early poems gave back to the movement, to my wonder and gratitude and delight, poems that became almost talismanic. I mean, women quoted parts of them, they put them on T-shirts and posters, and the poems came to have a life of their own. You're holding Monster, that was one of them.
Yes, I'm holding Monster, because Monster became a phenomenon.
Yeah.
It was born as a poem, and it became like a T-shirt.
It became like a manifesto,
Yeah.
a political manifesto. I was amazed. Then, and that was in 1970. Over the ensuing years, I think most of the tension between being a political activist and being a writer has been time. It's been over the issue of time, because writing requires solitude, discipline, and focus, and political activism requires discipline and focus and many other people. So there's been a sort of rhythm in my life of that when I was doing the one, I always felt guilty, being a woman, for not doing the other. And when I was at my desk, I felt guilty that I was not at the barricades. This is finally, in my 50s, now begun to resolve itself.
Can we try to go step by step from Monster, which was what you were saying, like a manifesto, to other highlights of your life as a poet? For example, at a certain point you wrote The Network of Imaginary Mother, which is luckily out in Italian, in a beautiful translation by an Italian scholar, Paolo Zaccaria, and it's in a book called A lettere scarlatte, Poesia come stregoneria.
Sì.
It's a beautiful long poem.
It's a beautiful translation also. I mean, it sounds even better in Italian than it does in English, because Italian is so musical, yeah.
Anyway, can you tell me more or less what happened, not only in terms of your politics, but in terms of your writing, moving from this very aggressive Monster poem to The Network of the Imaginary Mother, up to the very last, most recent poems, which will come out in America next year, 1989.
Correct.
A hot January. Both in terms of the contents and, most of all, the language, the metaphors.
Well, I am a pushover for metaphor. You have to understand this. I mean, if you blow a good metaphor in my ear, and I will follow you anywhere, you know. And sometimes I think that, for me, feminism itself is the ultimate metaphor for metaphysical transformation and evolution of the species on the planet, and that's why I'm involved in feminism. But we won't go into that right now. Monster itself was, in a sense, a second phase. It's because it's the first poem of mine, or book of mine, it was the title poem of a book, that burst like a little comet on the scene. It's thought of often as my first phase. It isn't. It came secondarily to a period when I wrote what among poets is called an academic poetry. This did not mean that I was based in the academy, never have been, and have a certain awe and at times reverence and at times total confusion about people who are. I don't know how they survive the bureaucracy and the arrogance and the ignorance and the pretense that the academy is not political. But they do, and I'm glad when courageous women try, because courageous we should be everywhere. However, I was what is called in English language poetry an, quote, academic poet. That is, I wrote in quite traditional forms, sonnets, villanelles, sestinas, strict rhyme or slant rhyme, and very complex invented forms. Mm-hmm. So there's been, politically speaking, almost a dialectic going on here. When Monster came along with this consciousness, it broke the shape as well as opening up mm-hmm. the language, as I mentioned before. I mean, that words came into my poetry that were not considered previously, quote, poetic, like dishcloth or diaper. And then at that point, those next poems all broke form. They were free verse or blank verse. It was as if the rage, the expression, couldn't be contained. Mm-hmm. I do happen to love form, however, even if it is to violate it. Robert Frost, one of my countrymen, American poet, once said, well, you know, writing poetry without form is like playing tennis with the net down. And in some respects, I think that's true. But over the years, as I matured as a poet, matured as a woman, matured as a writer in prose as well, and I hope matured as a political activist, all those maturations fed into each other. I do mean maturation, I do not mean mellowing, mm-hmm. because in fact, I think if anything, I've grown more radical with age. Most women do. Most men do the opposite, cross-culturally, which is interesting. But the maturation politically meant a number of things. For one thing, there were more of us. There were many of us. There weren't a few wonderful, crazy women leafleting on a street corner, as in the mid-1960s. We were everywhere. We were different. We were diverse. We had to learn to celebrate that diversity and not settle for simplistic, one-type only feminism, as if, you know, there was a feminist Vatican, God forbid. That the strength was in the diversity, and yet we would affirm our similarities. Now, the more there are, then the less a certain kind of panicked militance becomes necessary. It can become, like one's tactics, the language becomes more sophisticated, and that's a luxury one can have with numbers. That parallel maturation was happening at the same time as growing older as a writer. And the enormous joy of not feeling alone, because wonderful, wonderful voices from women writers were beginning to be heard all over the world. And when I decided to compile and edit Sisterhood is Global, which was this massive anthology that took 13 years, it was a special privilege to seek out women writers that the English-speaking world, my world, had not heard of before, because there was a kind of imperialism going on. Feminist writings in English would go out into translation, but feminist writings in other languages would not necessarily come into English. So that was one of the priorities of that project.
When was it exactly?
Sisterhood is Global was published in the United States in the first US edition in 1984.
And it's still available in the bookstores?
Oh yes, absolutely. And it's in Spanish, Mujeres del Mundo. And there's a Commonwealth edition as well. Unfortunately, that one's not in Italian.
And then it was also, you did something else a few years afterwards. You did Sisterhood is Powerful. Right?
Sisterhood is Powerful was the first one, actually. Sisterhood is Powerful was 1970, and that was US specific. And then I embarked on Sisterhood is Global, and that was the international one, and that basically took 13 years of assembly.
How many copies you sold of Sisterhood is Global all over around the world so far? Can you tell us?
I think it's approaching 300 or 400,000. But actually that doesn't count the Spanish language edition, so it would be more than that. And Sisterhood is Powerful, which was published in 1970, is close to 2.5 million. It's never been out of print. One day between 1970 and 1998, it still is going strong. You know.
Can you tell me specifically the project you worked on with both Sisterhood is Powerful and Sisterhood is Global? because you were saying collecting all these voices unheard of.
Yes.
Both in the States and outside the States,
Yes, in the
because
two
there is a
different
South also in the States,
Absolutely.
right?
There's a South in Italy, there's this global South in the United States.
And it can be in the North, right?
Precisely.
So collecting all these voices, not telling about them, but letting them tell about themselves.
Yes.
One. How many people, how many women did you involve in both the projects?
Oh, there were thousands. I mean, literally thousands.
Yeah.
Particularly in terms of global feminist activism, and I consider sisterhood as global, an act as well as a book.
Sure.
In those contexts, as the one who dreams up the crazy project and then fundraises for it and compiles it and networks to get the right voices and edit it. In that context, I see my role primarily as being a road or a form of access, because I am a woman of the global North. I'm a privileged woman in that I'm an educated woman. Not in formal academy. I very proudly don't have a BA, a Bachelor of Arts. Never graduated college. So I'm taught in universities now all over the world, but and I have 3 honorary doctorates, but I don't have a BA. But I take a certain perverse pleasure in that. But to use that access and that privilege that I have, I'm a European American woman. In other words, I'm white. I'm educated. I'm global North. With all of the oppressions that I do have coming at me as a female human being, as an artist, still there is, compared to other women's status, I have privilege. So my job is to use that privilege and that access to open doors, help make connections, and then step back and let those voices through. When I am being a political activist and when I'm compiling anthologies. When I'm doing my own work, then that's the place for my own voice. And I hope that I know that it exists in my mind very much in a context of those other voices, their complexity and the way they interrelate to each other. The kind of communication women now have with each other, in a sense, is the first in the history of the planet. It's not the first or second or third wave of feminism. It's more like the 10,000th. But it is the first time that the cathexis of that yearning and communications that make it possible are happening. So I'm very conscious, as Dante was, of being in a political Florentine situation. I'm conscious of the politics and the political age in which I live. There is something else that happens, particularly in poetry, and to some extent in my prose when it's really going well, which is that you reach the universal or the eternal, if you're lucky. But you always do that only through the specific. Sure. If you try to go there directly, then you're off into some boring, dull abstraction that is lethal.
Let's stay on this issue of being general and at the same time very specific. Being able to speak for many women and still speak for yourself, about yourself. Demon Lover is the case, in my opinion, because Demon Lover, which is a political essay, you are trying to describe the relationship between violence, sexual violence, violence at large, and masculinity. But you don't do it in the usual way.
No.
Usual
way is not my style.
No. And you do several, in a way you experiment a lot in Demon Lover, because it has, altogether in the Italian edition, they are like 9 chapters, 10 in the original, 9 in the Italian edition. And each chapter, at least 4 of the chapters in Demon Lover are like literary experiments too. I would like you to tell us more about the actual writing of that specific essay and the care you show for language and, again, literary experimentation there.
Thank you. Well, you know, when men mix genres, they are called, geniuses and accomplished, and they're called men of letters. When women mix genres, we are called dilettantes. So there's just a wee tad of a double standard going on there. And it's boring again, and I don't like to be bored, and so, I say the hell with it. With Demon Lover, again, it began with the specific. I had been in the so-called left in my country, in nonviolent actions for many, many years, and then when the left turned more violent, I did as well. And I wanted to know why I had done that retroactively, because I was fortunate in that I didn't die or be sent to prison. I didn't kill anyone or physically hurt anyone. I did damage quite a bit of property, and that, I have to confess, gave me some satisfaction. But I wanted to know why, because many of my friends did die and were jailed for life or were fugitives underground. And I also wanted to know what was the process by which I had been drawn out of that ethos into something else. So the book began as a personal exploration, and that's one of the voices that you're hearing in the book. But also, as the book grew and I began to realize how much violence was considered essential to manhood, how much the male body was taught to view itself as a weapon, and what then did that do with the female body, and how come it came to be the target. As all these things began to fall more into place, the study grew. It became cross-cultural. I began to read more and more about both classic definitions of terrorism, which is always insurgent, it's usually leftist, it's national liberation struggles, etc. But that didn't content me, because in fact I'm interested also in state terrorism. And I'm interested in religious terrorism, whether it is religious fundamentalism or whether it is the Vatican or whether it is Islamic fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism in the United States, Jewish fundamentalism in Israel. And then the various travels that I went on as a political activist fed into it. It's a process of many streams always flowing in rivers to the sea, and the sea for me is the page. So when I went into the Middle East and the Palestinian refugee camps twice during the 80s, once before Intifada and once during Intifada, I went there already abhorring violence and already seeing it very much as a male patriarchal approach to problem solving, and one that was integrally involved with a male patriarchal, please understand, I don't mean generically male, view of virility. Nonetheless, I went in humbly assuming that Palestinian women would share that tactical lust because of their situation. I mean, I never go to other countries to organize or teach women feminism. I go to learn. And to my great shock, it was one of the most amazing revelations, because in fact Palestinian women in the refugee camps, the poorest, most acute suffering I had ever seen, I also found the most profoundly complex, feminist, whether it called itself by that name or not, anti-violence. For them, the demon lover had no eroticism and no glamour. They knew him very well, not only as the Israeli occupying authority, but as their husbands, as their mullahs. They knew him, and they wanted no part of him. And out of that came an exploration of what I call the third way, which is neither violent confrontation nor a traditional passive resistance or passivity, but is a very active, witty, other kind of approach, which I began to notice women using strategically in all sorts of places all over the world. So there's that voice. There's a sort of journalistic repertorial voice in The Demon Lover. And then at another point, I fell into the very real despair of having just being saturated with all the data I was reading. And then I wrote the Crazy Lady chapter, which is almost novelistic. So many of these, and at first I did think, oh, well, isn't this a bit mad? I mean, you know, it's not consistent, it's not linear, it's not dry, boring, and academic and patriarchal. And then I thought, oh, good. Oh, hallelujah. And the response to The Demon Lover in English, its US edition and its British edition and its Commonwealth edition, was amazingly heartening, and it has since gone into Japanese, into Chinese, now wonderfully in Italian as Il demone, amante. And next year it will be out in Arabic by Arab feminists who have made it as an act, I think, of enormous courage. Their insistence, they wanted this book in Arabic. It will have to be smuggled in, I'm sure, to some Arab countries, I mean, but it will be there openly in others. And it's extraordinary. I mean, literature goes places you can't always imagine. I wrote something called A Woman's Creed a few years ago with a group of women, including Milano's own wonderful Paola Melchiori was in the group. And it was an international group, and they all fed ideas into it and then sent me off as the word person to do the writing. And A Woman's Creed, which I think is at the back of Cassandra, the interview, yes? You did it at the back of Cassandra non abita più qui?
Cassandra non abita più qui.
Più qui. Has gone into many different languages. And recently, just a few weeks ago when I was in South Africa, this amazing gift was given to me in that I was in a very poor, battered women's shelter in one of the poorest townships outside of Cape Town. And I saw this huge poster, enormous poster, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And I said to the Kasosa woman, Pumla Mkenyi, who ran this center, "Where did you get that poster?" And she said, well, that is our favorite poster here because it is the only poster, the government prints it, the New Republic of South Africa prints it, but it's the only poster we have that really speaks what is in my heart. And I began to cry. And she said, "What?" And I said, "Do you know who wrote it?" She said, "Oh, I think it's there in small print at the bottom." And she looked down and she read it, and then she screamed and looked at me and she began to cry. And everybody was crying and laughing and embracing. And I don't know if she knew what an enormous gift she'd given me to hear a black South African Kasosa woman say that this piece of writing had spoken what was really in her heart, because it was written by a tired, white, North American woman in a small room at 4 o'clock in the morning about her own life and what she'd learned from other women. And that's the power of the word.
And I have a very last question about this.
Yeah.
Let's say about your methodology, because I have seen your methodology in action, not only through your books, but in our tours. This is the second time you tour Italy with me, and I have seen clearly what you do. Which is
what do I do?
What do you do? You basically collect stories. And you do what a poet usually should do. You take these stories and you basically retell them and you bring them to other parts of the world. I keep thinking about Anna Akhmatova in front of a jail in St. Petersburg.
I know that story.
You know the story.
Yes.
At this point I can say that you do the same.
Oh, I would be grateful to do the same.
So your text becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and your political activism becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, because you basically you collect and you redistribute things, naming things. So, for example, the Italian edition of A Demon Lover ends with a story you have collected in Catania 2 years ago.
Yes.
But in Bari, you have given us the gift of the story of a Zulu woman. So you are a very strange, pivotal figure, in my opinion. And you are in effect suggesting a political methodology based on connecting and networking and trying to see what is positive all over around.
Oh, yes.
So if you could say me something, and then we...
I just think that, it's one might as well leave negativity to the patriarchy. I mean, it does it so well. And I think, for me, I understand despair. I understand women's falling into despair. Very difficult not to. But despair is one thing. Despair has a certain energy. Negativity is more like a whine. And for me, negativity, or when women snipe at each other, or when women settle for what I call horizontal hostility instead of directing the anger at the patriarchy, at the system, sometimes at individual men, but at changing things instead of, just tearing our hair. When that kind of negativity, that horizontal hostility, to me is a failure of intellectual nerve. And what I am interested in are, the reason I think I'm interested in making the connections is that to me it seems the essence of feminist energy at its best. I mean, patriarchy is brilliant at compartmentalizing. By age, by race, by class, by sex, by national boundary. You separate law from justice. You separate sex from love. You separate, pigeonhole, divide and conquer. You see it staggeringly carried out to such a high degree of artifice and architecture in South Africa, it takes the breath away. And feminist vision, to me, and energy is about the exact opposite. It's about a sort of insouciant insistence on looking at the connections and acknowledging differences, acknowledging diversity. My God, it's our strength as a global movement. I mean, we're the majority of the world's population. I certainly hope we're not all marching in cookie pattern replicas to each other. That would be very bad tactically, and it would be boring. So that there's any one kind of feminism, to me, sounds hilarious and jejune, sophomoric. I speak of feminisms because this is a vast mosaic with the majority of people on the planet, women involved. It has to be a mosaic. Okay, so how can I not then, in my own work, look to connect? It also connects with what I said earlier about being a woman of the global north. I don't speak for these women, but if I have access, if people will come to hear me, if I can get published and people will read me, then how can I not celebrate these voices? It's to my great delight that when Sisterhood is Global first came out in the States, no one in North America had heard of, for example, Nawal Saadawi or Fatima Mernissi, the great Egyptian and Moroccan writers, or Slavenka Drakulic from Croatia, or a number of others I could name. And now they have all sorts of books in the English language, of their own. This is fun. This is good stuff. It's different from the patriarchal mode that wants token women. And it's different from women falling into the patriarchal mode and wanting to be only the one token woman up there in Olympus with the boys. I don't. I want to be in lively conversation with women all over the world. And if the work can reflect that, it's an honor. I reserve the same respect for my own individual voice as a woman, and that's taken some time to have that same respect for my own experiences and not either trivialize them or make them secondary out of some leftover guilt politics. But guilt is, again, counterproductive and unnecessary when there is a positive energy at loose. So yeah, if the stories keep, maybe I'm just basically a traveling minstrel telling stories. But women speaking to women cross-culturally is quite miraculous. And it's there that you hear, if you listen carefully, the same voice. Because being a poet is not only to sing, it's to listen. Not for nothing, we speak of the ear.
Can you finish this beautiful conversation reading us one of your most recent poems?
Oh, I'd love to.
A poem which will come out in the next month.
Yes.
In this collection called A Hot January.
Yes, yes.
Which I hope to see in Italian too.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that. I mean, talk about making connections. You yourself are pretty indefatigable on that very front. I mean, connect. This is in A Hot January, which is the new book of poems, and it will be out in '99. Just so you know that I don't just preach these things. I went through 3 or 4 years, really bad years, of real despair. Ill health and the breakup of a long-term relationship, and everything sort of crashed at once. Menopause began, which is, I suddenly discovered, was not just socially constructed. So all sorts of ironies came into play. The worst of it, though, was that I couldn't write. For the first time in my life, I couldn't write. Mm-hmm. And my way of surviving difficult times, the death of my mother, whatever, has always been to write my way through it. So if you can't write your way through it, what do you do? Well, I cooked a lot and I gardened a lot and I relied on wonderful friends a lot. But finally, after years of discipline of getting to the desk and writing dreadful, ghastly poems, it came again. And in a sense, this is a book about art and the word resurrecting a particular woman. This poem is called Cave Dwellers, and it's in 3 parts. Part 1, the glowworm caves, Waitomo, New Zealand. Every tourist enters a cave uneasily. This one is narrow, chilled, dank, water leaching from fissures veining the walls, the ground slippery, springy. Skin becomes moist, or is that sweat from fear? The air is stifling, too thick with echoes of a distant om from subterranean rapids. The only way back is ahead. But then the tourist stumbles into a room-sized galaxy, to crane aghast at sequins of light spangling the low-ceilinged dark, rippling bright or dim in time to currents of air drafting the chamber. The tourist sees spectacle, entire constellations shimmering deep underground. The tourist blinks, awestruck at such gratuitous splendor. Splendor is never gratuitous, and only the strong should risk learning how and why beauty is forged. Each glowworm excretes and then dangles almost 70 threads. The eggs are laid so the larvae live in the threads, eating trapped insects drawn by the light given off as a lure by the worm as it dies. The tourist does not see these million microscopic rituals of birth and murder, a brutal loveliness indifferent to curiosity, disgust, or praise, a splendor gratuitous only in the sentimental gaze of every fearful tourist drawn by the same lure of light down into the dark. 2. The Altamira Caves, Santillana del Mar, Spain. How wonder must have fed her, the 9-year-old straying from her father's foraging for arrowheads and flints, who followed a trail of geometric figures and handprints, then cried out, "Oh, look up, oh, look up there," pointing through the torchlight at whole herds flickering wild with color, movement, and dimension, unwitnessed for more than 15,000 years. Horned, bearded bison grazing, galloping, curled asleep in black and ochre, horses standing, heads turned, a female boar fluid in mid-leap, a flock of mountain goats, small black bulls lowering, and engraved and scraped as well as painted, in strokes so delicate nostrils still flare beneath that wide, fringed eye, the life-size, perfect, startled deer. No one knows how or why or who did this, who worked by the glow of smoky peat fires, squatted or kneeled in these corners or lay flat, cramped, face up to paint as another would later do, who conceived of using the rough protuberances of rock as natural relief, this bulge a bison's hump, that hollow a horse's flanks, whose eyes burned with the effort to revision a running form Exactly. Experts argue meaning. Totems for the hunt, perhaps? A sacred sanctuary, a site for magic rites? Magic indeed that drives some prehistoric child to press a handprint in the damp clay wall another child will find. Magic that compels some Paleolithic genius to leave the cook fire and sketch with pity the panic in a hunted bison's eye. 3. Speleology. Tourists and experts have no place in caves. We who dwell here lifelong are, as Plato feared, indifferent both to splendor and to sanctuary, driven instead by rituals for invoking what we sense hovers in the air to feed us, weights buried in the rock for us to draw upon. We live obsessed by playing with the light we've learned we can give off before we die.
Thank you very much, Robin.
Grazie.
It was a pleasure.